for having me. My name's Claire. I'm from the University of Hertfordshire, and I'm going to be presenting on behalf of the TFL study team. Please excuse my front door that's going to start banging in a minute. I've thrown them all out. It should be nice and quiet now. So the presentation's going to be on a media analysis we did of the advertising restrictions on the Transport for London network, so very commonly referred to in the press as the junk food ban, which would have been 2 years ago now. As you probably all know, in response to children's diets and childhood obesity, food advertising to children has been regulated on television for quite a while. But as part of a kind of a wider body of work, that's not me, I promise. As part of a wider body of work to kind of tackle childhood obesity in London, in February 2019, Transport for London, headed by Sadiq Khan, the mayor, they brought in some advertising restrictions on the advertising of higher fat, salt and sugar food, so HFSS or junk food, on its network. And this was really significant because Transport for London owns one of the most valuable outdoor advertising estates in the world. So there's quite a lot of money involved in this, and it was quite a big deal in the press and quite symbolic. And also quite controversial in the press. So initially it had sort of very high public approval, but it was also very hotly debated. And this wasn't something I think that we were originally definitely going to cover, looking at the media representations of it. But as the study was ongoing and all this was going off in the press, I kind of decided that this is something we should focus in on. So there's a nice timeline on this slide that wasn't made by me, it was made by Rebecca Meixin, who's a research fellow on the project, and I've just taken it from a paper she's about to submit. So thanks, Rebecca. Just to give you an idea of the timeline. So May 2018, there was a launch of a public consultation on the restrictions. In the November, they announced the policy was going ahead. In the following February, it was implemented. And then later on in the year, after some teething problems, they updated the guidance. And how a food or a drink is defined as HFSS or junk food, they use the nutrient profiling model, which is the same one they use for television restrictions. So per 100 grams, you kind of get, and I'm sorry if I mangle this, like the bad foods and then take away the points for the good food. So it's a points-based system, so it balances out. So if you get a score of 4 or above, then that's a HFSS food, that's junk food, and then it wasn't going to be advertised. So quite a blunt instrument in some ways, but there was an exceptions process again, and it was cushioned. So this is the thing that we're really interested in looking at in the press. And the aim of this part of the work and of the paper was to kind of identify the rhetoric used in UK newspapers to argue against the restrictions. So there are arguments for, but we're really interested in the ones against, because then, you know, within public health, they're the ones that we kind of have to take issue with. So if to jog your memory, if you remember, it was Sadiq Khan who announced it. He was very much the figurehead for it, and there was an awful lot of in the press about it, and we've got an example there. So in order to do this, to look at the ban, we looked at UK newspapers and trade press, and the search period was from the beginning of March 2018 till the end of May 2019. So we wanted to cover the launch of the public consultation, as in on the previous slide, and then the announcement that it was going ahead, and then the implementation. And we searched Factiva, I can never say it right, sorry, for the news coverage, and then also manual searches on Google. And I'm using the royal we, I didn't search it. Christelle and Vanessa, who both work on the project, who are named on the last slide, they did the literature, they did the article search. And it gleaned 152 articles. So once we had the articles, the first step was a thematic analysis, so we can just do a broad brush, arguments for the restrictions, arguments against the advertising restrictions. And then once we had the arguments against, we focused in on them on a document analysis, because that's the bit we're interested in. Why are they saying that this, you know, quite popular policy to stop so-called junk advertising to children to reduce childhood obesity, why is that considered a bad thing in some of the coverage? So if you have a look at the spread of those articles as they were selected, so as you can see, if you think light green is the national newspapers and dark green is the local, so a lot of interest, and you can see the spikes in coverage around. The first one is the launch of the consultation, and then later in the year the announcement of restrictions, and then another spike around implementation. But obviously it's quite hotly debated, and a lot of that coverage is when it was first announced. So when we look specifically at arguments against the restrictions, against the ban, they all tended to be based on two central claims. So the first way of kind of saying that this is an intervention that shouldn't go ahead was to say that childhood obesity was not an appropriate problem for TfL to try and tackle. And then the second claim that was, even if they did try and tackle it, advertising restrictions were not the right way to go about it. So it all kind of hinged on this. And there's three main ways in which these claims were justified. So first, they identified more important alternative priorities. So you shouldn't be focusing on childhood obesity. There's this going on, there's that going on. All these things are more important, very typically violent crime. Second way of doing that was by kind of undermining the evidence or the science behind the restrictions. So how do we know it will work? What proof have you got it will work? The nutrient profiling model, that point system, that's faulty. So undermining science. And then the last one was kind of highlighting the potential costs of the restriction. So saying it's going to cost an awful lot of money and it's all going to go horribly wrong and it could be the end of TfL. That was kind of the implication. So I want to take you through a couple of examples of each of these. So more important alternative priorities. So you've got an example here from the Daily Star. So if you remember at the time this was in the press, there was also quite a bit in the press about knife crime and young people and gangs and violent crime. And this was constantly put up as something that should be tackled instead. You know, why is the mayor focusing on childhood obesity, on advertising? There should be much more, you know, violent crime is life or death. This is a much more important priority. So this particular extract is after Sadiq Khan got a bit of a grilling on his policy on breakfast television. And this is a tactic that's used a lot with tobacco and alcohol industries and the food industry. So it's not a new technique to say you shouldn't be focusing on this. There are more important things. There are other priorities. Casting doubt on the science, and this was probably the most popular one, especially around the points-based system, because it would mean that things like olive oil and hummus or condiments in general, really, because of the way they're made up, wouldn't be allowed to be advertised, so you couldn't have images of them. And this kind of also got bound up with lots of cultural claims about food and nostalgia, and if you're interested in food sociology, all that type of thing. So there'd be lots of criticisms about, oh, you know, what about ice cream vans and your grandmother having jam and scones and things your grandmother would have eaten? And what about wholesome things like olive oil and class claims? So at the same time as saying that the NPM, this points-based system, didn't work, also tying those criticisms to senses of national or classed belongings or nostalgia. So really quite emotive. I think if you remember any of them, you might remember that strawberries and cream at Wimbledon couldn't be advertised, and there was a lot in the press about that, and Farm Drop had a lot to say about it as well, as you can see there. And the last one, of course, is the potential costs. And again, not a new one, but saying that it's going to cost millions in lost revenue. That's going to be less money to spend on the network. That could be fare rises for passengers. It could leave a hole in TfL's budget. All these terrible things will happen because there won't be enough money as a result of this ban. So this was also quite a popular one as well. And again, like the where is the evidence, the science is flawed. This one as well is kind of not a new tactic. So this is a kind of industry claims. But interestingly, this is coming from the press, picking up on those industry claims, or using that language. I think to summarise, it's interesting that these claims come from quite a well-worn industry rhetoric about it, but in this case, it's coming up in the press. And we know, counter to those claims, that in the longer term, most public health interventions are kind of cost saving because they reduce pressure on services. So that kind of undermines the claims about it's going to cost too much. Very often, even if those restrictions target industry, they don't tend to result in long-term negative impacts for industry. We didn't see large spaces where there would have been adverts or anything. And a lot of the criticisms of the ban, they didn't acknowledge the finer details. There was an exceptions process, and there was extensive guidelines on the restrictions as well that could be engaged with. And these claims that tended to be around, oh, there's not enough evidence, the NPM is flawed, we don't know if this is going to work. None of these claims tend to say exactly what sufficient evidence might be, so they're very difficult to argue against. So I suppose in summary, if you think about the rhetoric to argue against structural interventions like this one, it's very similar to the stuff that we've seen before. And it's this idea it's not the right priority. And even if it were, this is not the right way of going about it. And these are kind of taken from harmful commodities industries. And it's towards this kind of general way of thinking about public health as lifestyle risk and individualizing it, and around that kind of narrative of choice, which unfortunately didn't have a great deal of time to get into about this, but that kind of underpins it. And some of the things we've identified that could have been more, I suppose, more emphasised to defend the policy and to defend interventions like that is highlighting the positive outcomes. And arguably there were some from this that we didn't see so much in the press. So it did serve to lessen advertising of so-called junk food products, which would be a good thing, and thereby increasing space for the advertising of healthier foods and encouraging brands to reformulate their products so they've got healthier versions so that they can advertise them. So those are some of the things in the paper we're just submitting and redrafting that we think that public health advocates could focus on more. So thank you for listening to me, and the rest of the research team are there, and please let me know if you have any questions. Thanks.